It's funny how we often talk about things, and I don't know about you, appear to be going around in circles, is the impression I'm often left with, especially when we talk about this subject, urban sprawl, which has been described as a devastating man-made environmental disaster. Now, on face value, that may well be true, but there are so many other factors that come into play. Governments, of course, are struggling with housing affordability, the cost of meeting reduced carbon targets, and keeping the economy afloat. They're allowing an environmental disaster to unfold, so we're told, before our very eyes, and that disaster is urban sprawl. What used to be highly productive farmland close to the city, or simply beautiful virgin bushland, is now paved roads, a sea of roofs, and virtually no trees. Environmental devastation on a grand scale, this is how it's been described, and all because they're not willing to allow higher density living near existing infrastructure within the current footprint of the city. Now, that's an interesting statement in and of itself, which we'll come back to in a moment. And what about the additional cost of both providing and maintaining all of the additional infrastructure required? More taxes, perhaps? Well, that's not going to be palatable. Steve Chandler is a property development expert and joins us on the program. Steve, this is an interesting topic simply because one of the lines here I found really interesting is you say that they're not willing to allow higher density living. In fact, I would say that this has all been turned turtle. Communities that are potentially affected by higher density living resist it with a passion. 3 weeks ago, we had state government elections, and in those municipalities that are most greatly affected by infill targets, for that read higher density living, are the ones where the anti-density candidates got up by the highest margin. So therefore, it would seem that councils are reflecting what many of their constituents are thinking, that they don't want to see an increase in density. And at the same time, we have people like yourself and others suggesting that we need to do it. I often use the term winning the hearts and minds of people. In other words, you have to convince people that this is a good idea and it's a path that we should take. I would say on that issue alone, and to me that seems to be the elephant in the room. There are all sorts of conversations we have, but nobody turns around to people, especially in those areas that are going to be most strongly affected, and say, you have to accept this. This is the way of the future and this is what's going to happen. Because those communities are resisting it, and in many cases resisting it with a passion.
Definitely. There's absolutely no doubt that people don't want higher density. That's a generalisation as well. There's a lot of people that haven't got an issue with it. I suppose it comes down to, and what I'm trying to say here, or that conversation I'm wanting to really push with is we've seen all these recent protests regarding the environment. We've got all this environmental devastation. We're destroying the environment. We've got to do something. And yet when you look at a very fundamental level, what's happening from a government zoning, land zoning perspective, governments are allowing us to destroy land around the outside of our cities on a massive scale. They're destroying what was either this great farmland or what was pristine bushland, and they're allowing us to destroy it so we can put roads and houses and more roads and more houses and cut down all our trees. To me, it makes absolutely no sense that on one hand, here we are jumping up and down about our carbon footprint and destroying the environment, etc. And yet, on the other, we're saying, hey, look, we don't want medium density. We don't want to make better use of our existing infrastructure where our forebears destroyed the forests, etc., to create our cities. What we're saying is we want to keep going and destroying more and more and more and making people have homes on these smaller and smaller parcels of land where they're effectively living in an apartment, but it's on a parcel of land, but it's now 45 minutes, an hour, hour and a half out of the city, depending on where you might live in Australia. To me, it makes absolutely no sense that we're saying we want to stop this greenhouse gases, we want to stop this environmental damage, and yet I want to have a parcel of land with a house on it 45 minutes out of the city. It makes no sense to destroy what is good quality environment just because we don't want to put an extra story into a particular locality. That's my conflict that I see this. I think people really need to start looking at every time you jump up and down and say, no, we don't want additional density in this area, it's the traffic's already too bad, etc., etc. What happens when you push out into urban sprawl? You're making people travel further. You're getting this more traffic anyway, it's just in a different location, but you're destroying the environment at the same time. Why wouldn't you want to have additional density in an area that's already got a railway running through it and better utilise that rail to take cars off the road and keep the bush out the back. Just doesn't make sense to me, Chris.
I understand the point that you're making, but once again, we get back to this issue of the hearts and minds. Some of the areas where some of the infill targets, and let's call it density because that's what it is, some of the areas where that is most desirable and perhaps would be most beneficial also happen to be some of the areas where it is most resisted. Now, look, I have no doubt that here in Perth, the MetroNet plan from the state government clearly is built around higher density, people living closer to public transport hubs, especially train stations, and there being much higher density, more people being able to use those train stations, more people cycling, more people using public transport in its various different forms, less people using private cars. I have no doubt that to achieve this, the state government wants to use the State Administrative Tribunal as its effective proxy. This is how I see it playing out. Applications for this, in accordance with government MetroNet plans, are going to be made. Local communities are going to resist. Local councils are going to say no. It's going to find its way to SAT, who are ultimately going to say yes. So therefore, effectively, SAT will become the proxy decider for the state government in order to ensure that its MetroNet plans are carried out. Meantime, local government's going to turn around to its constituents and say, terribly sorry, we said no, but we were overruled. And then what's going to happen is the state government's going to say, well, it wasn't us because SAT made the decision. And once again, you're going to have a whole bunch of people who are happy. At some point, do we have to take the rip the Band-Aid off the wound quickly approach rather than one hair at a time where it's very, very painful and very, very drawn out? Or do we take the approach where it's quick and sharp and we say to people, these are the areas that are designated, this is what is going to happen, and you have to accept it? Look, I guess for people who live in some areas, that's not going to be very pleasant. I suppose the only upshot for them is potentially they could make some money selling out of a house. Whether they want to or not, of course, then becomes another debate in and of itself.
There's always going to be people, myself included, don't like change. We like things to be the way they've always been, but they won't be. Technology's changing. Everything's changing at such a rapid rate, even the motor vehicles that we drive. And who knows what's going to happen in 10 years' time or 15 years' time with the vehicles that we drive. Maybe all this argument about traffic is going to vanish because we're going to have a better transport system. I don't know. What I do know is if we keep pushing out, the next thing you know, one of the outer suburbs of Perth might be Albany. Eventually, you just push out. You destroy everything in your path. We just can't do that. It's not sustainable.
Is part of the problem the fact that we're not having also a rational debate? Yes, we talk about the urban sprawl, and one of the very interesting facts about Perth, it occupies a greater land area than does metropolitan London, and it has a fraction of the population, so that says it all. But the other thing is,
certainly does. Yeah.
We have done a lousy job of decentralising. For example, we've got Perth, which is near as damn it to 2 million people. Then our next biggest city, it's so close to Perth, we think of it as an outer Perth suburb, but technically it's classified as regional, is Mandurah. I think that's just nudging 100,000. So what we're saying here is that our biggest regional city after Perth has about 5% of the population of the metropolitan area. In other words, there's a huge disparity between the population of Perth and the next biggest regional centre. And you look at some of our regional centres, you mentioned Albany. Could Albany be 10 times its current size, around about 300,000 people? Well, short answer is yes, it could. Would it be better for that region if it was that size? I think the answer is yes, it would be, because 300,000 isn't a huge place, but it is a place that would then be self-contained. People who lived in Albany wouldn't have to come to Perth. People who lived in the surrounding regions, rather than come to Perth for things like specialist appointment or hospital treatment, they would logically go to a place like Albany. So yes. Does developing a place like that make sense? Short answer is yes. Will it happen? History says no. And I think when you also look at the way places like that have developed, they too have been quite resistant to any change, especially in Albany, which has shown itself to be rather conservative in that regard. So therefore, when we look at places like that and say, could we develop it? Well, the answer is yes. Will we? I suspect the answer is probably no, and that's where the problem starts.
Yeah, at some point, though, like everyone likes that, little village atmosphere type scenario, and yeah, it's wonderful to have that. But when you've got the population growth, you've got all the things that are happening globally, if you look at our cities, and you go, what's the best utilisation of land? And when you look at, you mentioned London, so London's footprint is what its footprint is, and the only way that you can really, it's got reasonably good public transport. If they go up another story on everything, they can put a lot more people into London without affecting the environment around it. So is the answer then for us to have this, the conversation of, well, listen, the choice is we can have increased density in the footprint that we've already got, or we just keep destroying the environment around us, or, as you've just rightly raised as well, is this decentralisation scenario. Do we actually focus on creating more major regional centres that can then operate more effectively and efficiently by themselves when they get to a critical mass? So I think when it comes down to all this sort of stuff, government is so critical in this, and it's the strategic planning that it appears to me to have been lacking. So I've been in the industry nearly 4 decades now, and I look at the strategic planning, and some of it's been pretty good, and some of it hasn't been. And that's, I suppose, the issue is strategic planning takes a back seat when there's an election to be won.
Yeah.
And I think, over the last sort of 20 years, I can see not just, Australia-wide, but you've got this whole scenario of win the next election, not what's good for Australia. So what's good for Perth, is different to what's good for Western Australia. And politicians who are trying to win an election, they're going to just focus on winning that election. So unfortunately, we haven't got the strategic planning that we should have. I think they did that a lot better back in the good old days, probably even before I was able to vote. So I think the government needs to take a far better approach to strategic planning. And I think all of us, as members of a community, really need to have this discussion about, if we really want to save the environment, how are we going to do it? Are we going to stop this urban sprawl, because that's environmental damage like you wouldn't believe? Are we going to better utilise the infrastructure that we've all paid for with our taxes? What are we really going to do? Because we can't just sit here and say, we don't want additional density, right? And we don't want urban sprawl because we don't want environmental disaster. What we need is to have this argument, or not an argument, but a discussion. If it ends up being an argument, great, let's have that too, because we can't resolve anything unless we talk through the hard issues. And this is definitely a hard issue.
There is no question about that. Steve, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Steve Chandler is a property development expert, and this seems to be one of those discussions that we are still having. And to me anyway, nobody seems to be having a frank and honest discussion.